Hello and welcome to SE7EN. And supporting a tedious comedic link to the actual subject of this lecture, employing state-of-the-art CGI, which is AI assisted, as you can obviously tell, I am your laughing cavalier, Matthew Mills. And because I know many of you have been losing sleep over exactly what a Laffer Curve is and why should you know something about it, I thought we'd do a lecture on it. So the Laffer Curve was created by an economist called Arthur Laffer, which I guess is where it gets its name from, apparently as part of a conversation in 1974 over dinner, where he was trying to explain the relationship between the amount of tax that you charge to individuals and companies and the amount of tax revenue that you actually get in your treasury in the United States. And here's a picture of the actual napkin on which he scribbled that explanation and the original curve itself. And what Arthur, I mean, we'd obviously be on a first name basis, I don't think he'd mind. So what Arthur was trying to illustrate is that there is probably an optimal rate at which you should charge tax to individuals and companies. So if you don't charge any tax whatsoever, you obviously don't get any tax revenues in and you can't support public spending. On the other hand, if you tax everyone 100% of everything they earn and companies 100% of every bit of their profit, they've got absolutely no incentive to work whatsoever. So there's what he's probably trying to argue is that there's an optimum somewhere in between. So the principal implication of the Laffer curve is how taxation translates to economic growth. What we've got here is a graph of what's called supply and demand and how it affects prices. So the general idea is you've got supply, which is the amount of stuff that companies produce, and then you've got demand, which is the amount of stuff that people want. And the idea that Laffer put forward is that if you reduce taxes on individuals, they've got more money to spend on buying stuff. Equally, if you reduce tax on companies, then they can supply stuff at whatever price they're going to charge for it, but actually they'll have more profits and you can tax those. So that would drive the economy forward because people are buying more stuff and companies are being more profitable. And this graph is just to illustrate the idea of how supply and demand affects prices in just a little bit more detail. So basically, when the demand for stuff is higher than supply of stuff, so basically when people want more stuff than there is, prices tend to go up. And you can probably remember that after COVID, when nobody had been producing anything and suddenly we all got released and we had our furlough payments in our pockets, burning a hole in our pockets, we all rushed out and it pushed up the prices of things. On the other hand, when there's loads more stuff than people want, so there's a really unpopular product and you can't actually get it off the shelves, you have to lower the price to actually increase demand. And that's basically what this is showing. So Laffer then formalised his curve into a series of postulates. The first one being that high taxes stifle growth in an economy. So if you're paying huge amounts of tax as an individual, you haven't got any money left to spend. If you're paying huge amounts of tax as a company, it's very hard for you to make profits. So if you lowered tax on a company, you could increase their profits. Now that then makes that company more attractive for an investor because that company can pay dividends to that investor. Equally, if you lower taxes on individuals, you can increase their demand for goods because they've just got more disposable income. So the idea being, if you get this optimal rate of tax right, if you reduce taxes to the right level, you can incentivize both work, so people to go to work, earning money where they've got loads of disposable income to go and spend on stuff, and you can incentivize investment into companies that make that stuff because those companies will make more profit that they keep and can pass on to investors as dividends. Now, this idea sort of really took flight in 1981 when a former US B actor, baseball commentator, and 2 times California governor became president of the United States. Of course, that is Ronald Reagan. And what we've got here is, which I'm pretty sure is almost the exact transcript of the conversation that was had between Ronald Reagan, was sitting behind the Resolute desk, and between Arthur Laffer, which at that point he got tenure for his ideas at the University of South California. Basically, the economy in the US at this point was floundering, and Ronald Reagan was looking for a way to rejuvenate things. So he spoke to Arthur Laffer, who then said, well, look at my curve, and I think what we should do, taxes are far too high because people are paying, higher rate taxpayers are paying up to 70% tax, and companies are paying 30 or 40% corporation tax. So if we reduce those tax rates, people can buy more stuff and companies can make more stuff and make more profit. And Ronald Reagan went, that's brilliant, but it's really complicated, and your curve has some really difficult maths with it that are written down on that napkin. So why don't we just coin a term that everyone can speak and remember? Let's call it Reaganomics. To which Arthur Laffer obviously said, well, listen, you're the boss, you're the president, you can pretty much do what you like. And then obviously asked for a grant so that for his university to carry on working there. Now, obviously, Ronald Reagan was very excited by the ideas underpinned by the Laffer Curve, so he rushed off to his Secretary of the Treasury, the bloke who is in control of all the budgets, and said, look, I think what we need to do to really get the economy motoring is we need to reduce taxes for individuals and companies. And what the individuals said, oh, brilliant, what a brilliant idea, because of course everyone would want economic growth, but of course if you're going to cut taxes, you're going to reduce revenue to the Treasury, which is there to pay for public spending, and you've got to pay for it. And one of the ways that governments can pay for things that they want to do is they can go and borrow money. So what the US administration decided to do was they would go and borrow money to pay for and fund these tax cuts. At which point it's time to just take a quick attention break and just something which I genuinely think is hilarious is when the US government borrows money, they issue what are called loan notes, and certain of their loan notes, the amount of interest that they will pay to the person who's loaning the US government money will go up and down with the rate of inflation. In fact, it will float. The rate of interest will float with the rate of inflation. And these government bills are called floaters, which Americans with no sense of irony whatsoever do not understand is absolutely hilarious to English people who have a culture which is largely based upon the toilet. Anyway, another fantastic and fabulous fact brought to you there by SE7EN. So back to the Laffer Curve, and I see a hand going up in the audience and a question. So did it work? Did Reaganomics actually deliver? And the answer is yes, to begin with. The US economy, in response to the tax cuts that were brought in by Reaganomics, had a massive uptick in terms of actually GDP, but also in terms of the stock markets, because companies were making more profits, largely driven by consumer demand and people spending more because they had more money in their back pocket because they were paying less tax. So well done there. But, and what a but. Tax cuts drove massive economic growth, increase in profits of companies, driving up stock markets, increase in quality of life for people. However, the borrowing that was required by the US government to pay for taxes massively accelerated, outstripping tax revenues by a massive margin and driving up the US national debt to something like $2.8 trillion over the course of a single administration. Now, just by the end of the Reagan administration, public debt had grown to such a point that the interest payments on that national debt were becoming unsustainable. And what that meant is that subsequent administrations had to increase taxes and reduce public spending to counter the increase in debt that had been brought about by Reaganomics. So although Reaganomics had delivered a massive uptick in economic growth, corporate profitability, stock markets, and individual standard of living, that then had to be paid for by tax increases and significant reductions in public spending by later administrations. So there's a massive cost to it, which ultimately ended up being relatively negative. And what does that have to do with the price of eggs, I have you say? Well, I'll tell you. What's interesting about the United States is it's not very old. They don't have a lot of history. And I don't know why, but maybe it's because they haven't got a lot of history that they have trouble remembering it. But what's really important and critical is that history teaches us valuable lessons that we should be taking into the future. And one of the people who might want to be paying attention to those lessons is our new Chancellor, John Healey, pictured here, who's going to be delivering his first budget on October the 28th. And so one of the things that we might consider here is, are there implications of the Laffer Curve, supply and demand economics and Reaganomics, and the lessons we could learn there that should be actually built into any decisions, policy decisions that he makes in his budget. So possibly reflecting history a little bit, John Healey will be stepping up to the podium with a level of public spending which has massively increased alongside the level of public debt, largely driven by the cost of bailing out the banks during the credit crunch, pictured here, and then the massive cost of funding all the measures to deal with COVID. And really, the principal objective of his budget has to be to get the economy going, to basically start paying off this debt and reducing the level of public spending and all those costs that are associated with it. Now, at the same time, UK taxes are set to reach an absolute eye-watering record level. And the reason for that is that post-COVID, the Liz Truss administration put forward a budget from outer space where they're going to spend lots of money, and they weren't quite clear about how they were actually going to pay for it. Financial markets around the world responded extremely badly to that, and to pay the much higher rates of interest that global investors now require of the UK government, tax rates had to rise to pay for it. So one of the things that John Healey might be looking at is he could be thinking about the Laffer Curve, having obviously seen the beginning to this lecture, because I know he looks in, and thinking, well, what we could do is we could cut taxes. That will increase discretionary spending power for consumers. It would increase potential profits for companies if we cut corporation tax, and that could drive economic growth, which is all good, laudable stuff, as you can see. And he obviously likes that idea, which you can see from this picture here. Oh, but oh dear. Unfortunately, stymieing that plan is the fact that UK national debt has also climbed to one of its highest levels since the Second World War. And the national debt is basically almost 100% of the amount of income that the country produces during the year. Again, largely down to the disastrous Liz Truss budget. So the issue that John Healey now faces is that absolutely, if you could reduce taxes, you could potentially drive forward demand and corporate profits, which would be really great for the economy. But the problem is your debt levels are so high, the only way you could do it is with more borrowing, and financial markets around the world aren't over keen on lending the British government any more money. So when you consider John Healey's position in the context of the Laffer Curve, he finds himself basically on the horns of a dilemma, because you'd really like to reduce tax rates, but the pressure is actually on him to increase tax rates to pay off high levels of interest on a massively ballooned level of national debt. So he's between a bit of a rock and a hard place. And making that rock and that hard place just a little bit more uncomfortable, if it could possibly be, when we look at the implications of an ageing population and the cost of welfare. The Burnham administration over the next 5 years or so has to find either an extra 120 billion quid in tax revenues, or the same amount of savings in public spending cuts. So adding to the problems that John Healey is now going to face, that we have this massive level of debt, we've got very high tax levels, so we'd like to reduce them, but we can't really afford to. He's in a position where if we don't fund this 120 billion quid of either tax rises or public spending cuts, the country could well go broke and have to go off to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout, which is absolutely less than ideal. So obviously what you can see is the strategy they're taking is they're both supping there on a couple of pints of potential juice to bring forward some booze logic, and having a good old think about exactly what they're going to do. Anyway, so that's the Laffer Curve put forward by Arthur Laffer in 1974, and its potential implications for the chance of going into the budget. But what have you learned? Well, the Laffer Curve depicts the relationship between tax rates and revenues, and it was used to justify massive tax cuts by Ronald Reagan in a strategy which was monikered Reaganomics. Now, it led to massive US economic growth, but unfortunately the cost of that was an even greater increase in national debt, which became unsustainable and led to higher taxes and reduced public spending later on as, to pay it off. The UK at the moment carries historically high tax and debt. The Chancellor needs growth, but with high taxes and high levels of debt, he's going to actually struggle to have any latitude, if we think about where we are on that Laffer curve, to find an optimal tax rate, a lower tax rate, to drive that growth. So as to the question of what is he going to do, well, I guess we're going to have to wait until October the 28th to find out, but those are some of the metrics which will be underpinning his decisions. And sparing a thought for the challenges now faced by our latest Chancellor as he comes up to his first budget speech. This is just to remind you that this lecture, and it is a lecture, is designed to inform, to educate and entertain, and most definitely does not represent financial advice. However, if you'd like some, then you know where to find us.